Microscope. I'm Michael Young. Thank you very much for joining us this evening. With me in TVG studio is the Honorable Minister of Agriculture, Dr. Leslie Ramsammy. And this evening we're going to be having a very focused discussion on the country's drainage and irrigation system. Thank you very much, Dr. Ramsammy, for joining us on Under the Microscope. This afternoon, Dr. Ramsammy and I, along with some other experts in the field, would get down into the nitty-gritties of the functioning of the country's drainage and irrigation system. We're going to look at the problems, we're going to look at the challenges as well as the accomplishments and progress that has been made so far with respect to the system. Dr. Ramsammy, there's much talk now about the country's drainage system, irrigation as well, big issue. Whenever it floods, whenever it rains, everyone wants to know what is the government's position, what is government doing or what is government not doing. My first question to you this afternoon has to do particularly with the system as it was before. Before the People's Progressive Party Civic took office, what was the state of the country's drainage and irrigation system?
Thank you very much, Michael.
You're welcome.
And I'm glad that we at the Ministry of Agriculture and Drainage and Irrigation in particular are under the microscope this evening. I think indeed Guyanese need to put the drainage and irrigation system under the microscope, and people need to know and appreciate what is being done. And so at the very outset, let me say that Guyana has done a remarkable job when it comes to drainage and irrigation. Drainage, when we talk about drainage and irrigation, we're talking about water available for agriculture. From the time of creation, agriculture and water went together. There is no such thing as agriculture without water. And whether we're talking about crops or we're talking about livestock, water is critical. And so drainage and irrigation are crucial elements of a successful agriculture program. In Guyana, that means a lot to people's everyday life, because with agriculture, we have become a food-secured country. With agriculture, we are a exporting country. With agriculture, we have built our economy. And it is through agriculture that Guyana moved from subsistence livelihood to, in fact, a least developed, highly indebted country, and moved on to a low middle income country. It is through agriculture that we, in fact, aspire, and we know we will become a high middle income country. And one day, we will be living in this beautiful little country that is a developed country because of agriculture. So having said that, and having established the fact that drainage and irrigation are crucial elements of a successful agriculture program, we can go back in time, long before the PPP. It started long before the PPP.
Okay.
It started, in fact, in Guyana with the colonialists who established the sugar industry in Guyana. Much of the drainage and irrigation that you and I today see and we experience around the country was built for sugar.
Okay.
Sugar was agriculture in Guyana. And yes, we had the indigenous people with subsistence, livelihood, and so on. But organized agriculture in Guyana started with the colonialists establishing the sugar industry. In the 17th, 18th, 19th century, much of that, this drainage and irrigation, the canals, the sluices, and so that we see in the country were built by the colonialists, by slaves and indentured laborers. Your ancestors, my ancestors, our ancestors built it. Much of it. So a lot of these canals, and so we go and touch the water, and we know we have touched the handiwork of our ancestors.
Okay.
But, and in fact, the interesting and remarkable thing is that even by the time your grandparents were born in this country, if we go up to the 1950s, the drainage and irrigation system in Guyana was the same exact system that was designed and built by the colonial masters to support sugar. Indeed, it was not until 1886, after the initial infrastructure was put in, that the British was able to build what we now know as the East Demerara Water Conservancy. And so the sluices like Maduni and Lama that release water from the conservancy into the Mahaica-Maikoni area, sluices like Five Doors at Land of Canaan, and Kunia that release water into the Demerara, were not built until after 1986. And so as we entered the 1950s, that was our drainage and irrigation system. We were at the mercy of heavy rainfall. When there were dry seasons, it was very difficult outside of the sugar district to get water for irrigation. The 1950s represent a real revolutionary period, not only because we were fighting for independence, but through the vision of men like Dr. Chetty Jagan, the drainage and irrigation system, as you and I today, as children today know it, as farmers today know it, outside of what the colonial masters built for sugar, and then for the East Demerara Water Conservancy, much of it was designed, was visualized. The concepts and the visualization came in the 1950s. So in the 1950s, we see that Chetty Jagan wanted agriculture to be more than sugar.
Okay.
So rice, cash crops, livestock, making us self-sufficient for food, came through the revolutionary development for drainage and irrigation. I think people need to know that.
Okay.
And so Blackbush Polder was established with all of its canals and so. Canal Polder, the Tapakuma schemes, Mara on the East Berbice, and so on were all built during that time. Together with that, some revolutionary things happened. In Essequibo, we had the Tapakuma scheme and waterways, and that was supported by something called the Dawa pumps. The Dawa pumps, when you get there, it's a majestic thing that remove water out of the Pamaroon, place it into the Tapakuma, and that is the water that the farmers utilize when there is no rain. In Berbice, through the Manarbisi, we were able to take water from the Kanji and place it into the canals for use in sugar, in rice, in cash crops, and so. Most Guyanese have not seen these things. Many of us have seen the Niagara, and we have seen many things, but we have not seen such stupendous structures like these. And here's the problem, that when you pull the water from the Kanji into these canals sometimes, particularly in dry season, you sometimes risk pulling salt water from the ocean into the cultivation area. To prevent that from happening, a really majestic structure called the Torani Canal was built. You know what the Torani does? It links the Berbice River to the Kanji Creek, so that when we need more water to prevent salt water from coming in, we are able to bring fresh water from the deep recesses of the Berbice River into the Kanji to support irrigation throughout Region 6 area, rice, sugar, cash crops. It wasn't until the 70s and 80s that another plan from the 50s, which was what is today popularly called the MMA, the Mahaica-Maikoni Abari scheme, was constructed. But we never finished the job, because that dream of the 50s was only implemented in the 70s. People will recall Dr. Jagan lost power in 1964. And it wasn't until the 70s that the first phase of the MMA was constructed and it was stopped. So the second and third phase of the MMA was never completed. So today when we hear about the facade drains that drain water out and so on, we must appreciate this, that from the 50s, Cherry Jagan had a dream that Guyana will be an agriculture country and agriculture will take us to the next level. We built more canals, we put sluices, and many of the sluices that you know today at Buxton, at Victoria, and so on, Windsor Forest, and so were constructed, these sluices, to help drain water out. So together with Manor BC, Mybe Curie, Dawa, and so bringing water for irrigation, and together with all these sluices and pumps, there were many pumps, because remember that the sluices let water out during low tide, because at high tide we can't open the sluices, and that's when the pumps come in. Taking my time to do that, because people need to know that these canals and drains and so on were constructed over a long period of time, and after the estates were established, it took until the 50s for us to put many of these other structures in place. And so by the 70s, we had a network of drains, canals, sluices, pumps that were draining water. And one last point on this, all of those systems that were developed over centuries were designed to empty enough water that would come from 1.5 inches of rain for a 24-hour period.
Well, of course, Dr. Ramsammy, much of that has changed, and we're living in a modern era where not only some of those very structures that you would have mentioned are now non-functional, some of them have, have to be changed, repaired, and all of these upgrades
let's get
done.
back to that history, because I talked about everything we did up to that brought us into the 70s and 80s. Here is the part that we shouldn't be so proud of, which is the 70s and 80s, because of non-maintenance. Take Dawa, for example, so critical for about 70,000 acres of rice land in Essequibo. By the 1990s, Dawa pump was limping along.
Why? Apart
no
from
maintenance, no investment was made. Same thing at Manor BC, same thing at Mybe Curie. All the drainage pumps along this coast were dysfunctional, were abandoned. They were no longer existing. Many sluices were no longer opening, and many of the canals today when we drive and we see a nice expanse of water, those were taken up by vegetation. So that even though all of those things were designed for 1.5 inches of rain in a 24-hour period, the truth is by 1980, and then taking us into the 1990s, we could handle less than 1.5 inches of rain. And so when the 1990s came, the challenge was that what we had was barely functional, but something else was happening by the 1990s.
And what was that?
Global warming and climate change. So that the 1.5 inches that we were catering for, we couldn't handle. But now we were beginning to have regular cycles of droughts because of El Nino. And that's critical because now we depend on the irrigation structures. The pumps were not working, and therefore we couldn't irrigate our land as effectively. On the other hand, when droughts were finished because of El Nino, we were dealing with floods because of La Nina. And then, because we couldn't empty more than 1.5 inches per day, there were cycles of floods. And that's what we had to respond when the PPPC government returned in 1992.
There is this public notion and thought that the response may have been poor. whether in its initial stages or latter stages, because in 2005 we would have seen the greatest flood that Guyanese would have experienced, and then right after that in the heels 2006, and then communities continued to be inundated by water, and water that was stagnant as well. And there was this notion as well that the drainage and irrigation structures that we had invested so much monies in at the beginning of the 1990s had now failed the Guyanese society. And as expected, the blame was solely at the feet of government, your government, of
And
course.
you asked me a question earlier, why? Why did it fail in the 70s and 80s? Well, in 1990, 92, you know what the annual investment was for maintaining the drainage and irrigation system in Guyana? 20 million. Now it's in the billions. And so the first question was, why did it fail in the 1980s, was that we were not investing in such a critical element of our everyday life, because it's more than agriculture. It's about where people live and they get flooded out. It's about health and so on. So we were not investing. Answer is very simple. That's why you couldn't replace the broken down pumps. That's why you couldn't repair the sluices. That's why all the canals were taken over by vegetation.
Has much changed, Minister? Because from 1990, 2005 floods, 2006 floods, 2007, whenever it rains, communities inundated, people are complaining.
And the answer, in fact, is much has changed.
What has changed?
And for one, drainage and irrigation for farming, for agriculture in this country is far, far superior to what we have. Two, if the system that we had in the 1980s was what was functional today, we would have permanent floods in our residential area and in our agricultural area. Okay. The truth is, if you take 2005, in January, you average, long-term average, in January, we shouldn't expect more than 120 millimeters of rain, generally in the country. In January 2005, we used to have that, more than that, double the amount, every single day, from about the 15th of January to the end of the month. So for about 15 straight days, each day we had more rain than we would have had all month. And therefore, if we didn't have a functional system then, the water that reached you here would have been up there. That's one. Two, since then, we have had cycles of flooding, not as great as 2005. But the truth is, let's not go back to that far. Let's take January 2012.
Let's talk about that.
January 2012, we had some floods in Canal Polder. We had some floods along the East Coast and Georgetown for a few days. But we had flood that lasted more than a few days in the Mahaica, Maikoni, Abari area, and in Blackbush Polder. And so what we need to bear in mind is that in spite of all the billions that we have spent, we have not yet completed the job, because all that investment we made to put in those structures in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and in addition to the work that the colonial people had done, because they had been left without maintenance, we had to put all those things in place. It took hundreds of millions of dollars to put back all the pumps at Windsor Forest, at Buxton, at Victoria, and so on. We had to put those pumps back in place. But we discovered that even if we had put everything back in place and make them work optimally, that we are no longer dealing with 1.5 inches of rain per day.
Then what needs to be done?
So we need to build more structures. And so that's what we have been doing. New canals, new sluices. An example of a new one that everybody's been talking about is, for example, the Northern Relief Channel at Hope.
Yes.
But that's only one of many. We have to look at when Blackbush Polder was established. We hadn't completed all the structures. So now that we are having more rain, and in addition, we have put more housing, more farming, and so on, we need to improve the drainage system. Same thing at Canal Polder, and so on. So what we have to do now, and people need to realize that with what we came into 2000, if all of that was working perfectly, we still would not be able to handle very heavy rainfall. And therefore, whether we like it or not, we have to find the resources to invest in expanding the drainage and irrigation. And at the same time as adding more structures, more pumps, more sluices, more relief channels, we have to make sure those we have, we maintain them at 100% efficiency.
In areas before, we're going to have a very spirited discussion with respect, a little later on with respect to who is really responsible and what will be government's position hence, as we go forward. But in areas where there's no reason why they should be floods, so like for instance, negligence, persons not doing simple things like checking the cokers, looking at the equipment, and so in Georgetown we had a very foolish situation, forgive me, where when rain came, 4 pumps or 3 pumps were not working, and really the ministry must have some way of dealing with negligent NDCs, negligent officers who are responsible for manning this drainage and irrigation system. Well, municipalities as well, right? But I want to know what is your position on dealing with that.
I think it's a very important question because whilst I've described the structures, the canals and the pumps and the sluices, somebody has to be in charge of them. The National Drainage and Irrigation Authority has responsibility overall for the policies, for resources to build more structures, etc. We also operate some of the sluices and pumps. The MMA, the Mahaica Barry Authority, also has responsibility for some of these structures in the MMA region. Gaisuko runs and operates some of the sluices, pumps, drains, and canals.
Okay.
But also the region, the RDCs, have responsibility for some of the main drains, secondary drains, and so on, and some of the cokers, and some of the pumps. And then you have the municipalities and the NDCs also. So you see it's a shared responsibility. Unfortunately, not all of us have paid as much attention. You're right. In the recent flood in this city, there was no reason. In the old days, Liliendale and Kitty, and everybody know that there are 2 big pumps there.
Yeah.
They were broken, they weren't working. Kitty was abandoned. We had to come back in, the national government, and put them back in. And after repairing it, and again they were destroyed, we had to do it a second time. And that's when the National Drainage and Irrigation Authority took control of that. There are 5 pumps that operate in the municipality of Georgetown and 11 sluices. Often, the outfalls for these sluices are not clean. Often, these sluices are not operational. Often, the pumps are not working. In this most recent of floods in the city, of the 5 pumps, only 1 was working. And that one began to work after we, at the Ministry of Agriculture,